In June 1986, an interview was published with the Hungarian cultural minister in the journal Mozgóvilág. The journal itself is important. It was one of those cultural periodicals, besides Tiszatály and Medvetanz, where party press control had to intervene in the early 1980s. It was actually, the journal, an effort of the György Acél-led cultural policy to re-establish the compromise with the younger generations of intellectuals. But at the end of 1983, they decided to move the secretarial board, but to continue the project with a new loyal editorial board. The date is also interesting. The summer of 1986, the launch of Radio Danubius, a German language music channel, the first Hungarian Formula One Grand Prix, just to name some new events of international significance. But we are half a year after one of the biggest success of Hungarian cultural diplomacy. In October and November 1985, the European Cultural Forum was held in Budapest, one of the multilateral meetings of the 35 signatories of the Helsinki Final Act. It is also not uninteresting to note that the minister was called Béla Köpeci, a man of world horizon, an academician, born in Transylvania, researcher of history and history of literature, biographer of Ferenc Rákóczi, who studied in Paris at Sorbonne between 1946 and 1949. And the interview itself was worth attention, made by György Balogh, if not a media star, but a prominent cultural and political journalist. He put questions to Köpeci quite sharply, even if we know there was significant difference between a literary monthly and an 80,000 circulation daily newspaper. I would like to highlight the following statement of the minister regarding openness. A kind of openness to the world, both East and West, always could be evidenced, and this appeared as national interest and made the Finns learn languages and get acquainted with foreign cultures. There was technical development, but one of its engines was vocational education. A kind of cultural movement unfolded, and it was amplified by democratism to reconcile modern culture and tradition. I think, regarding the future of Hungary, even if, of course, under different circumstances, the Finnish example cannot be seen as a mandatory path, it is a fundamental recognition what we see as national interest here in Central Eastern Europe and what it brings for culture, professional skills, ideological cohesion. So let's stop for a moment. The Hungarian cultural minister in 1986 outlines the Finnish way of openness to the world in cultural affairs as example or best practice for pursuing the national interest. The big occasion, also touched upon in the interview, was the European Cultural Forum in Budapest, which can be evaluated as a moment of Hungarian diplomacy. The decision was made in Madrid in 1983. This was the first occasion to hold a post-Helsinki meeting in the Soviet Bloc. It was not an accident to opt for Budapest. However, Bucharest was also aspiring to be the first, and also not accidentally in the cultural topic. It acknowledged a certain level of cultural openness and an unceasing diplomatic activity from the 1970s. Partly, Hungary could pursue, as the Warsaw Pact countries had become active participants of the international scene, backed by the Soviet Union's position. Not independently, of course, but they could try to reconcile their own interests and the Bloc interest. This phenomenon is described as emancipation by Csaba Békés. The Helsinki process meant a kind of shifting gear for Hungarian foreign policy. Hungary became one of the most intense players, not only left from the Elbe, but among the 35 signatories. It was a unique and innovative initiative in 1976 to address the 19 Western states with written proposals encompassing all the aspects and baskets of the Helsinki Final Act. The main reason behind Hungarian activity was political and economic interest in the D10 process, where, of course, the Helsinki process was just one of the scenes. From the three baskets of the Final Act, as most other Comecon members, Hungary was most interested in basket 2, economic and scientific cooperation, while the Soviet Union, after winning the quest for European status quo, pursued the aim of a multilateral disarmament conference. But what made Hungarian activity different is so that Hungarian diplomacy could be active also in questions relating basket 3, while the USA and NATO countries were keen on pursuing their topics within basket 3, like religious freedom, traveling without restrictions, free flow of information. Hungary was less vulnerable in such topics compared to other Warsaw Pact countries. Let's take the example of traveling. Tourism was a main source of foreign currency for Hungary. From the 1960s, even foreign capital was invited to hotel development projects. Therefore, visa for travelers was a kind of point where Hungary could claim, even Hungary could claim mutuality on partners, like a French visitor could gain permission visa even at the border, while for Hungarians visiting Paris in the 1970s, it was a 1 or 2 week long process through the French embassy. Hungarians, if there wasn't any political issues against it, in the 1970s were allowed to travel to the West if they weren't denied passport. From the mid-1960s, limitations were rather set from the financial side. You can see a chart with numbers. So from 1975, the numbers kept growing. Also arrivals, so tourists coming to Hungary, but also departures, so Hungarians visiting European countries and also Western countries. You can see in the mid-80s, it was above 750,000 people traveling to Western countries from Hungary. And the number from Western countries to Hungary was almost 5 times as high. Hungarian foreign ministry could detect its strengths and weaknesses quite effectively in its proposals. In its weaknesses, it enumerated proceedings to show its efforts, like the availability of Western press, which was in fact really narrow and restricted in Hungary as well. But in its strength, it built concrete proposals, and in basket 3, it rather emphasized culture instead of free movement, as it recognized that this topic can be won. Finally, Hungary could even work out a proposal, the case of small nations culture, which was a lucky choice by all means. Hungary could hold Western countries up for equality and mutuality. It could build alliance across blocks, winning smaller Western European states, first of all Finland and Iceland, thus found a field where it could override Western bloc logic of open and closed societies within the frame of openness, as it could contrast big traditional Western cultures to smaller national cultures, the losers of language relations and globalized cultural industry. This kind of international activity was underpinned by a decade-long practice of relative openness. That of tourism could prove that Hungary was wide open, not only for tourists, but even for journalists who could enter the country quite easily. There was a blacklist, but the existing blacklist was not too long, and Hungarian government tried to update and reduce the list of 157 names before the Belgrade conference. Movement of people and tourists and journalists in the 1970s was not comparable to the Soviet practice, where several territories were strictly forbidden for both for tourists and for journalists as well. Data of cultural exchange could also be impressive, especially compared to big nations. And especially if we add classics and contemporary products, both also in theater, book publishing, cinemas, and Hungarian government did compare it and show it to their partners, especially to France, Great Britain, Germany as well. So this openness was not the result of the detente of the 1970s, but went back to the 1950s, to the de-Stalinization period. It slowly unfolded after 1953, with appearing visits like allowing tourists at the beginning for the occasion of international football matches, tours of artistic assemblies. But cultural imports grew surprisingly quickly. By 1955, in the cinemas, almost reached the 1/3 capitalist, 2/3 socialist ratio. In that regard, the years after the revolution, whatever we call this period from retaliation to consolidation, it did not bring a shift when we look at cultural statistics. My favorite example is the journal Nagyvilág, we are going to speak about a bit later, the first issue of which was released in October 1956, 2 weeks before the revolution, and reloaded in April 1957. In 1958, the Hungarian party issued its directives on cultural policy. It was a document referred to for 3 decades, but from our aspect of openness, the most important statement was that the party admitted the cohabitation of different artistic styles. A kind of catching up also started to take place in the following decades. Western cultural products and tendencies, genres, could find their way to Hungarian audience. The differentiated approach to publicity also paved its way. The lines of demarcation were foggy. The practice of 3T, especially the category of tolerated in the middle, made experiments, even small violations of limits, possible. Deliberately created narrow forums offered places for wider openness, like literary journals, club cinemas, studio theaters. The long-curved absurd theater, for example, which we must emphasize speaking about cultural openness, was on Polish scenes much earlier, from 1957, could first be published in the journal Nagyvilág in 1958. It was UNESCO's chairs. And Beckett's famous Godot, for an audience of 50-60 people at one occasion in 1965. This was a studio theater, one of these narrow forums. Even information policy was reconsidered in terms of openness in the 1960s. The 1965 party resolution on information and not press, as the previous ones, formed the basic thesis upon this statement: there is no information vacuum. Therefore, instead of suppression of information, the rule should be quick framing of information. At that point, Radio Free Europe was quite available in Hungary, as jamming was more or less suspended in 1964. The Radio Free Europe and Radio Luxembourg became part of everyday life to the extent that by the late 1960s, Hungarian radio decided to follow Western-style light music program to attract the younger generations. This process, anyway, was quite similar to the effect of pirate radios and Western public service broadcasting. And also one more thing, more and more cultural phenomena slipped from forbidden to tolerated. Just to name one more besides absurd drama that was cursed at the end point of nihilism, but was complemented as a human voice against dehumanization by the 1970s, when Beckett's play opened the Theater of Nations in Warsaw, again a first-time occasion in a socialist country. So the plus one is Harry Moore, who was criticized for irrationalist and inhuman tendencies in the late 1950s, but he was welcomed in the Hall of Art in Budapest in 1967 as a master of very common human archaic values. So, what I would like to underline in my presentation that Hungarian policy went further in cultural openness than it would be the simple consequence of first political reasons, peaceful coexistence and interest in detente, and economic and financial reasons, participation of a small open economy in need of foreign capital in world economy and in need of transfer of technology, which was quite directly linked with cultural openness only in some cases. For example, in the negotiations over Ford scholarship, when the bargain was about how many technological issues can be combined with humanities. While the economic reform could also not directly be linked to cultural openness, as it was deliberately narrowed to the field of economy and only some aspects related to culture. Most cultural actors were exempted from new financial regulations to protect socialist culture from the market bias. Also, cautiousness of not causing ideological and political disturbances within the country and in the Soviet Bloc went against spreading over to culture. Profitability could not gain official approval in a socialist country. Culture is not a merchandise, as the slogan worded, but financial aspects could not be neglected. They were present long before the economic reform of 1968. Cultural institutions had pursued, for example, cross-financing. Furthermore, the need for recreation and relaxation was officially accepted after 1956, so it was not all about educating people. As one movie critic put it after a typical summertime cinema lemonade, cultural revolution can be suspended temporarily for 90 minutes. But entertaining culture had to be supplied in large part from the West. With growing amount of Western cultural products, from Hollywood movies, French and Italian film comedies, action movies, musicals, bestsellers, crime stories, and TV series, etc. So this also opened up channels and created weird situations sometimes, like Hollywood blockbusters bought for huge royalties in the 1980s, where such films as E.T. could gain stronger media promotion than an ideologically supported Soviet film in category E. Category A, which was the supported category, because the extra price category of category C, where American movies were put, at least American popular movies, had to yield the expected high returns. The pressure of profitability amplified in the 1980s, especially after the decision of the political committee to promote financial reforms in the cultural sphere. So, relative cultural openness and relatively liberal movement of people had a cultural, political, and wider political foundation as well by the 1970s. But for clues within culture, let's turn to two symbolic journals of the de-Stalinization period. The Soviet Inostrannaya Literatura, founded in 1955, and the Hungarian updated version, Nagyvilág. I wrote updated version because by comparing the publications and the cinema programs of the Khrushchev era in the Soviet Union and Hungary, we can find significant differences which remained typical later on. The Soviet cultural import offered a wider selection geographically, with a kind of mondialist attitude being present everywhere from India to Chile, which also offered tools for maintaining a lower level, maintaining a level of seclusion from the Western culture, while the Hungarian way of cultural de-Stalinization returned to different patterns, to its traditional and still known Western relations, Francophile, Anglophile, Italianists, etc. roots, of course, within which Western progressive culture was preferred and entertainment could be imported. The rest of the world was rather an addition to the dominance of big Western cultures within the non-socialist category in Hungarian relation. Let's note, this also contributed to the associations between Western culture and progression and the revival of traditional transfer channels. So, in 1985, when Pál E. Fehér, a cultural journalist, saluted the 30-year-old Inostrannaya Literatura, he drew a complex literary renaissance on Soviet soil with several interrelating journals, Junost, Literaturnaya Moskva, Druzhba Narodov, Vaprosi Literaturi, and he underlined a reviving intellectual life should have a need for regular orientation in world literature, not for random introductions or clever individual initiatives, but for the exhibition of streams and development tendencies. We must measure the efficiency of our own artistic efforts, and it is not a shame to learn. And even more, this is the effective antidote of provincial reminiscence, shallow-minded fashions. Such arguments also occurred around the foundation and the anniversaries of Nagyvilág. Openness, of course, controlled openness to the world is the best cure for dogmatism, for example. Or world horizon is essential for a realistic self-esteem, but also to counterweight overestimation of Western products and Western streams, openness and Western streams. Or without learning, cultural development and vitality is unobtainable. So openness and quality and competitiveness are connected. And as György Lukács emphasized in 1956, realistic first-hand knowledge of the world is essential in combating provincialism. So provincialism comes forward again. Of course, we know and spoke about further reasons of entertainment, financial constraints, etc. But provincialism is an important category, or rather being not provincial. It remained a kind of key word in the self-definition of cultural actors and politicians of the Kádár era. Their so-called non-provincial practice in their self-definition was contrasted to two, or rather three, provincialisms in the 70s and 80s. First, the provincialism of the Horthy era, a seclusion from the progressive values. Second, the provincialism of the Rákosi era, an extreme seclusion from world culture. And third, and here we arrived back to Helsinki Basket 3, the provincialism of the West that is more seclusive against the socialist world on a market base than vice versa on an ideological base. Thank you very much for your kind attention.